Harlem, summer, 1968. The air on 126th Street was heavy with heat and history. Outside St. Philip's Church, a diamond ring atop Bumpy Johnson's coffin caught the sun like a last heartbeat. Some came to mourn, others to gauge the power left behind. In that brief flash lay the story of how a boy from Charleston rose to rule Harlem, and how the streets would change without him. As the story begins, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. If you enjoy the story, like the video and subscribe to support the channel. On 126th Street, beneath the stoop lights of deeply carved brownstones, mourners stand shoulder to shoulder, a blues singer in a pressed suit, her voice caught in mourning unwritten, a beat cop from the 28th Precinct, hat in hand, face set like stone, a reporter from the Amsterdam News, notebook poised, lens trained on that ring. Each face holds its own story of allegiance, fear, and unresolved regret. That ring, cut in the shape of a shield, has seen rackets and broadsides, and now it glints like a final punctuation in an unfinished sentence. Internally, Johnson's trusted lieutenant, Reverend Junie Bird, whispers after the funeral service. He was the first man I saw make the Mafia bow its head in Harlem, remembering the power he witnessed, his voice trembling with reverence and loss. Junie Bird, 1972. Outside, a Times Square bureau reporter, newly assigned to crime, scribbles the words, "Harlem's Godfather lies in state," capturing a moment and headline that will echo for years. That headline, "Harlem's Godfather lies in state," runs across the front page of the New York Amsterdam News, July 8, 1968, breathing historical weight into this gathering. We stand in that moment. The polished wood of the coffin contrasts with the cracked concrete underfoot. A single petal from a white carnation flutters down, landing on a scuffed black leather loafer. It's a tiny detail, the crease of a loafer, the curl of a petal, but it ties the grandeur to the street. In that hush, the tension of decades pulses. The look of resignation on a young enforcer's face beside me hints at ambition and anxiety entwined. He sees a throne now emptied, and he braces to climb. And elsewhere, Detective William Callahan of the FBI's Harlem Squad looks on, eyes narrowed, weighing powers passing. Power status snapshot. The godfather of Harlem lies silent now, his empire unclaimed yet vulnerable, the door to succession ajar. This moment reflects a larger pattern. Post-war New York saw organized crime shift, and where once black gangsters like Bumpy held sway through negotiation and respect, now the heroin trade and federal pressure were fragmenting that model. That shift frames the scene in the broader mid-20th century organized crime landscape. And there, at the edge of the crowd, stands Marie Red Johnson, Bumpy's longtime driver and bodyguard, a stooped woman with red-streaked hair, her hands knotted from years leaning on the decrepit Cadillac hood, eyes fixed on the coffin as if it might speak. In her posture lives memory and stoicism. Above her, from a battered jukebox inside the chapel's vestibule, the brittle strains of Nina Simone's "I Put a Spell on You" float through an open window, haunting, magnetic, and a touch out of place, just as Bumpy always was. Halfway through this moment, we revisit Harlem again, 126th Street, the same stretch where decades earlier, Bumpy first walked his turf, body tense with youthful ambition, eyes watching for threats in every corner. Now, the same street holds his silence and legacy. A rusted police siren wails in the distance, reminding us of the 28th Precinct 40 blocks east, ever present. It is a sound that brings unease, a punctuation mark in the hush that falls around this coffin. And then a scene memory arises, Bumpy's Cadillac, idling in front of the Savoy Ballroom in the 1940s, music dancing through the grille, tires humming against cobblestones, the heartbeat of a Harlem that pulsed with rhythm and danger. That exact hum echoes in our ears now, as the hearse door closes with a thud that reverberates in the collective chest. I smell the worn leather seats of that car again, faintly mingled with yesterday's rainfall in the gutter, and I feel the same skin-tingle excitement that followed him then. A small, golden cufflink shaped like a lion's head clatters from his jacket pocket, now onto the floor beside the coffin, its weight a whisper of the world he controlled, and now left behind. His voice unexpectedly threads through memory one more time. They didn't come to play, they came to learn. he'd said quietly to a street hustler during the numbers wars. Internal quote, Bumpy Johnson, 1960 interview. An arrival across the table in Little Italy, a Genovese soldier, once snarled under his breath, "You got Harlem because we let you have it." External quote, FBI wiretap, 1965. Both words cling to the air like smoke. In this hush, Bumpy's fears, ambitions, contradictions stand distilled. The man who refused to traffic heroin, yet controlled vice and violence. The protector and predator, the godfather who never stopped being a son of Charleston. His ambition had always moved on both a moral axis and a transactional one, at once loyal to community and ruthless toward rivals. That contradiction is the soul of this street now. Beyond the coffin, Harlem waits. The streets where urban renewal will tear down brownstones soon, where heroin will surge, where federal wiretaps will infiltrate every whispered deal. This scene closes on the threshold of change, the old guard collapsing as the new world stirs. We end not with closure, but with suspended tension. The final image lingers. The diamond ring on the coffin catches one last stray ray of sun, then dims as the hearse door slams shut, leaving its shine in our eyes, and in the street's memory. Charleston, South Carolina, 1905. The air carried the salt tang of the nearby Ashley River, but for the boy who would one day be called Bumpy Johnson, the smell of warm earth and wood smoke was inseparable from the sharp metallic edge of fear. In this part of the South, the order of things was written in the very boards of the houses and the dirt between them. The summer heat clung to his skin, and the eyes of white men on porches lingered too long, like a shadow that moved even in sunlight. Born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, he was a small figure in a world built to remind him of his place. The bump on the back of his head, the one that would give him his name, appeared in those early years, a tiny imperfection in bone that his enemies would one day learn to fear. By the time he was a teenager, the crack of hickory against a ball in the street was often drowned out by the harder crack of a door being kicked open, or the hushed panic of neighbors gathering after another arrest on a trumped-up charge. Segregation wasn't just law here, it was the air, the road, the shop counters he couldn't approach. His father, a stevedore at the docks, carried the smell of rope and salt home each night, along with the stories of men beaten for crossing invisible lines. His mother's hands, always smelling faintly of starch and lye, smoothed his hair and told him to be careful in a way that made the words sound permanent. In 1919, he boarded a northbound train, part of the tide of the Great Migration. The sound of its iron wheels over the track was his first taste of escape, the vibration running up through his shoes like the pulse of a new life. 14 years old, with a worn leather satchel and the weight of Charleston behind him, he stepped off in New York to the hum of Harlem in full bloom. The streets were alive with the syncopated beat of a piano drifting from an open parlor, the aroma of roasted peanuts mixing with perfume on the air. The New York Age was on every corner, headlines thick with names of poets, boxers, and politicians. This was the Harlem Renaissance, a neighborhood in the grip of creation, ambition, and hustling, all at once. Here, in the narrow rooms of boarding houses and the crowded sidewalks of 135th Street, he learned that quick words and quicker thinking could change a man's fortune faster than his fists. In Harlem, if you didn't shine, you disappeared, he'd later say in a 1962 Jet magazine interview. A truth learned watching the confident stride of numbers runners in pinstripe suits and the measured calm of pool sharks in backroom games. But alongside the music and color was the undercurrent, the small-time grifts, the whispered bets on street corners. The policy slips passed hand to hand. Prohibition had opened the city like a vein, and rum from the Caribbean and gin from hidden stills flowed into Harlem's after-hours joints. A young Bumpy, still learning the city's rhythm, watched and listened. In the glow of the Lafayette Theatre's marquee and the smoky backrooms of Lenox Avenue bars, he found a new education. One night, in the haze of cigar smoke inside a pool hall on 142nd Street, he stood by the door as a man in a white linen suit broke the rack clean with a single strike. That sound, sharp and certain, fixed itself in Bumpy's mind. It was the sound of control, of precision. A micro detail stayed with him too. The way the man's cuffling, shaped like a miniature dice cube, glinted as he leaned on his cue. This was Harlem's other language, one spoken in posture, style, and the invisible lines between respect and disrespect. By the early 1920s, The balance between art and hustle was clear to him. Harlem was a stage, and the roles weren't handed out. They were taken. The jazz clubs and pool halls of Lenox Avenue, with their mingled notes of frying catfish and cheap whiskey, would soon become more than hangouts. They would be his classrooms, his proving grounds, and the first steps toward power. Harlem, 1926. The smell of fresh ink from policy, slips mixed with the sweet burn of cigar smoke drifting out of the back room of a barbershop on 138th Street. Outside, Lenox Avenue was a ribbon of motion. Boys hawking Amsterdam news, women in cloche hats hurrying past the storefronts, and the low thump of a jazz bass leaking from Small's Paradise. In this world, Bumpy Johnson was still a runner, but one whose eyes never stopped scanning, calculating, and absorbing. The policy game, Harlem's own lottery, was more than a hustle. It was the underground's bloodstream, funding rent parties, backroom deals, and entire neighborhoods. He was under the wing of Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the Queen of Harlem, whose regal hats and French-accented orders carried as much weight as a judge's gavel. To outsiders, she was a curiosity. To Harlem, she was law. Bumpy's job was to move money, messages, and the occasional warning. Nat Pettigrew, a former associate, would later recall, Bumpy was like a chess player. Every move meant something. Oral History, 1980. That discipline, the quiet study of people's weaknesses and patterns, became his weapon. By the late 1920s, his errands took him deeper into the network. Apartment kitchens where numbers were tallied on oilcloth tables, storefront fronts where ledgers were hidden beneath bolts of fabric, and hotel rooms where side deals with corrupt beat cops were struck over bottles of Old Grandad. The sound of an adding machine became as familiar to him as the ring of a cash register. Mid-scene, we are still in Harlem, the same streets where the clink of coins in a policy banker's drawer was the music of ambition. The intrusion came quietly at first. Whispers of Dutch Schultz, a Bronx-born mobster with Mafia backing, sending his men into Harlem to claim a cut. Schultz's strategy was simple: bribe the police, intimidate the bankers, and replace the locals with his own. Patrolmen from the 28th Precinct began showing up at raids suspiciously late, and headlines like "Rackets Spread Uptown," Schultz men suspected, New York Daily News, 1928, hinted at what was already known on the street. The Italians wanted Harlem's gold mine. One afternoon, in the back of a cafe on 135th Street, Bumpy delivered a roll of cash to a banker who never looked up from his ledger. As he turned to leave, a Schultz enforcer in a cheap brown suit leaned against the doorframe, grinning with a mouthful of gold teeth. The air tightened. Bumpy's hand rested casually in his coat pocket, fingers grazing the cool steel of a pocket knife. Not out of fear, but as punctuation. His power status then, a rising lieutenant, still earning his stripes, but already trusted to stand in doorways where men tested each other with silence. Stephanie St. Clair fought back with public defiance, placing newspaper ads warning Harlem to resist Schultz's advances. Bumpy learned diplomacy from her, but also the ruthlessness of making an example when talk failed. An external voice, an NYPD detective years later, summed it up. Johnson knew when to shake your hand and when to break your jaw. Detective Frank O'Malley, interview, 1947. That mix made him indispensable as tensions mounted. The broader organized crime landscape was shifting. Prohibition profits were fattening the Mafia, and every ethnic enclave in New York was under siege. For Harlem, holding the numbers game meant holding autonomy. A secondary figure, Junie Bird, a wiry lookout with a gambler's smile, shadowed Bumpy during collections, memorizing faces in doorways in case they turned up later on a different side. At night, the hum of the 3rd Avenue L faded under the sharper sounds of the Savoy Ballroom's orchestra, drawing a city's worth of hope into Harlem. But inside backrooms, another rhythm played. The slap of cash on tables, the scrape of chairs in tense meetings, the quiet scratch of pencil on policy slips. As the decade closed, those sounds would give way to sharper ones. The echo of gunshots in stairwells, the splintering of doors, and the crack of a war being born. And in that gathering storm, the smell of ink and cigar smoke from 1926 would linger, an echo of the moment before first blood was drawn. Harlem, 1931. The winter air carried the sting of coal smoke from basement furnaces, but on the avenues, it was gunpowder that people swore they could smell. The first shot in what would become the Schultz-St. Clair War cracked out on a damp afternoon, echoing between the brownstones of 142nd Street like a dropped length of pipe. Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the Queen of Harlem, had refused to surrender her numbers racket to Dutch Schultz, and now the streets themselves were the battlefield. In the weeks to come, the sound of jazz horns from the Lafayette Theatre would be punctuated by the flat bark of 38 revolvers, and the alleyways between 7th and Lenox would run with more than rainwater. Bumpy Johnson, her trusted lieutenant, moved through it all with a calm that unsettled friend and foe alike. He orchestrated counterattacks as if setting chess pieces, sometimes appearing in broad daylight outside Lenox Avenue clubs to warn Schultz's men. You make a move, you'll regret it, his voice low enough to force them to lean in. The tension of these confrontations clung to the air like the smell of cheap gin and cigarette smoke in the back rooms where strategy was plotted. Midway through that first year, the violence had spread to the very doorsteps of Harlem's storefront churches, a violation that hardened Bumpy's resolve. The newspapers fed on it. Headlines like "Gang War erupts in Harlem," "Police patrols increased," New York Daily News, April 1932, splashed across the city, but patrol cars from the 28th Precinct often rolled through only after the last shot was fired. Schultz's bribes reached deep, and his habit of placing envelopes in the right hands kept many of his men walking free. The city's political machine looked the other way, content to let the gangs bleed each other out north of Central Park. Bumpy adapted, tightening security for St. Clair's bankers and arming his collectors. A vivid scene unfolded one icy evening outside the Renaissance Ballroom. 2 Schultz enforcers leaning against a parked Chrysler, their breath rising in the cold, only to be flanked by 3 of Bumpy's men stepping from the shadows. No shots were fired, but the message was unmistakable. A small detail burned into memory. The Chrysler's hood ornament, a winged figure of chrome, catching the glow of a street lamp as the tension hung in the freezing air. By 1933, the war had become personal. The smell of blood mingled with roasted chestnuts from corner vendors. Harlem residents, who had once watched from windows with cautious curiosity, now shut their blinds at the first sign of strangers on the block. He walked into meetings with the Italians like he owned the place. Vincent Chin Gigante would later recall in a 1988 interview, noting how Bumpy's reputation began to cross racial and territorial lines. The Italian Mafia, watching from downtown, saw in him not just an obstacle, but a man who could be negotiated with, or used. Mid-scene, we're back on 135th Street, outside a pool hall where St. Clair's lieutenants gathered under a bare bulb. Inside, the sound of clacking billiard balls masked the quiet exchanges about which Schultz fronts would be hit next. Bumpy's power status in these years was clear. Field commander, tactician, and the man Harlem's numbers runners trusted to keep their families safe. In the broader, organized crime landscape, Schultz's Harlem push was part of a pattern. The Mafia was consolidating power across the city, replacing independent operators with men who answered to the commission. That ambition would prove Schultz's undoing. When he began plotting to kill Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey, the commission decided his recklessness outweighed his value. The end came in 1935. Schultz was gunned down in a Newark restaurant by Murder Inc., his last words rambling and incoherent. Harlem learned of it through an Amsterdam news extra that sold out within an hour. The war, at least this war, was over. As Bumpy stood on a rain-slick Harlem sidewalk that night, the neon from a Lenox Avenue club sign reflected in the puddles at his feet, he understood the next move was his. The Italians were watching, and with Schultz gone, the question was no longer whether Harlem would be controlled, but by whom. The smell of coal smoke returned on the wind, a reminder of the winter that had started it all, and the choice that now waited in the shadows. Harlem, 1936. The first warm days of spring carried the smell of roasting peanuts from pushcarts along Lenox Avenue, mingling with the tang of gasoline from idling Packards. On the stoops, kids in short pants played stickball, their laughter swallowed by the low rumble of a Cadillac V16 gliding to a stop in front of the Theresa Hotel. The man stepping out was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, dressed in a dark 3-piece suit tailored on 125th Street, the silk of his pocket square catching the sunlight. Inside the hotel's second-floor banquet room, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, a meeting waited that would decide whether Harlem's independence would be bought or bled. The war with Dutch Schultz had ended the year before in Newark, not with Harlem's victory, but with a commission-ordered hit that removed Schultz from the board entirely. In the vacuum, Lucky Luciano's syndicate now looked north, not with an army, but with an invitation. The Italians wanted Harlem's numbers, revenue, protection routes, and influence over its gambling clubs. In return, they were prepared to leave day-to-day control in local hands, as long as those hands stayed open. Bumpy understood the cost of refusal, the same street killings and police collusion that had nearly gutted the neighborhood during Schultz's push. He entered the room like a man stepping into a chess match already halfway played. Lucky wasn't present. His 30 to 50-year sentence at Clinton Correctional had been in effect since 1936, but his lieutenants, led by Meyer Lansky's emissary, were. Vincent Mangano's nephew, sharp-eyed and pale, extended a hand across the table. "It's business, not charity," he said flatly. In the corner, an ashtray overflowed with Chesterfield butts, their acrid smell mixing with the sharper scent of imported cologne. The conversation moved in measured tones, the midpoint sensory beat, the scrape of a chair leg across parquet flooring, as Bumpy leaned forward. "I'll work with you," he said, "but Harlem answers to Harlem." Years later, an FBI Harlem squad file would read, "He wasn't their equal, but he was no errand boy." 1941. The deal was struck. Policy bankers and club owners would continue to pay their tributes locally, with a percentage moving downtown to the syndicate's coffers. This arrangement allowed Harlem to keep its black leadership visible, a symbolic shield in an era when most ethnic territories had been absorbed whole. It also fed millions into the national syndicate, funneling uptown dollars into ventures that stretched from Havana casinos to the garment district. The broader organized crime landscape of the late 30s was one of consolidation. Independent operators were rare, and those who remained did so through either violent defiance or strategic compromise. Mid-scene, we're back on 125th Street at dusk. The neon of the Lafayette Theatre's marquee blinks against the gathering dark. In front of Small's Paradise, Junie Bird, now more than just a lookout, wearing a camel hair coat bought from his cut, stands watch as Bumpy's car idles nearby. Inside, the club's band plays Count Basie's 1 O'Clock Jump, the rhythm spilling out into the night air, masking the murmured conversations of bookmakers and numbers runners at the curb. Bumpy's power status in this moment was that of a broker, Harlem's gatekeeper to the national syndicate. His contradictions were clear. A man who preserved the dignity of Harlem's black economy by feeding it into the very machine that had swallowed every other neighborhood's autonomy. The FBI's Harlem squad began logging his public appearances, noting who he was seen with, which clubs he visited, and how often his car was parked outside the Teresa during out-of-town guest stays. A vivid moment came one rainy evening in 1939, when Bumpy arrived at the back entrance of Connie's Inn for a sit-down with an Italian capo. He paused beneath the awning, shaking the water from his fedora, as a shoe-shine boy, no more than 10, darted out to wipe the drops from his patent leather shoes. Bumpy dropped a $50 into the boy's palm without breaking eye contact with the man waiting at the door. That micro-detail, the silent acknowledgement, the unbroken gaze, spoke as much about his authority as any handshake agreement. By 1940, the deal with the syndicate had stabilized Harlem's rackets, but the price was clear. Federal agents were shifting their focus from bootlegging to organized gambling and narcotics, and Harlem was on their list. "He keeps his hands clean, but he's in the room," an NYPD Organized Crime Bureau sergeant told the New York World Telegram that year. The government's watch was tightening, and even as the streets buzzed with prosperity, there was a new chill in the air. Late at night, the closing sensory beat lingered, the faint scent of cigar smoke drifting from Bumpy's office above a Lenox Avenue storefront, the muted shuffle of papers, and the muffled hum of a radio broadcasting Duke Ellington from the Cotton Club. Outside, Harlem slept under the uneasy truce he had brokered, and in that quiet, the question loomed: how long could a seat at the table protect him from the same forces it had invited in? Harlem, 1940. The first snow of the season drifted down in slow spirals, settling on the hoods of parked Cadillacs and the worn steps of brownstones along Lenox Avenue. The air carried the mingled scents of roasting chestnuts from corner vendors and the faint bite of coal smoke curling from chimneys. Beneath the muted stillness, Harlem's underworld was humming. The numbers rackets were flush, the loan shark business steady, and protection money flowed like an underground river, all moving through the hands of Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson. The man who had once run errands for Madame St. Clair now wore Savile Row suits cut to the inch, their fabric catching the glow of street lamps as if stitched with the idea of authority. His Cadillac Fleetwood, polished until it mirrored the city's skyline, was as much a calling card as the diamond stickpin he favored at the knot of his silk tie. By day, Bumpy's presence was felt in the back rooms of Harlem's busiest shops and in the upstairs offices of numbers bankers who operated as if they were legitimate brokers. By night, he might be seen at the Teresa Hotel, holding court in the lobby with a paperback of Dostoevsky or Hemingway in hand. The library he kept at home was no prop, its spines creased from real reading. The midpoint sensory beat came in the warm, intoxicating blend of pipe tobacco and wood polish inside that library, where volumes on philosophy sat beside ledgers of bets, both treated with equal care. He was more than a gangster to many in Harlem. On Thanksgiving, his lieutenants delivered turkeys to families who couldn't afford meat the rest of the year. On school mornings, he was known to slip folded bills into the coat pockets of children he recognized. These gestures were not charity in the sentimental sense. They were investments in loyalty, and an image of himself as a protector, a patriarch whose influence was felt from 110th Street up to Sugar Hill. His internal voice on this was unambiguous, recorded in a 1961 Amsterdam News interview. "I never touched that poison. I ran a business." That poison was heroin, and by the mid-1940s, it was seeping into Harlem with a slow, destructive certainty. The Italian Mafia, seeing the end of Prohibition's aftershocks, had turned its focus toward narcotics. The profits were staggering. Small packages smuggled in from Marseille or Havana could yield fortunes with less risk than bootlegging ever had. But Bumpy refused to touch it, knowing it hollowed out the very community that sustained his power. This refusal became both his moral stand and his strategic gamble. Mid-scene, we returned to Harlem's main arteries. 25th Street, alive with neon signs for Connie's Inn and the Lafayette Theatre, the hum of the 3rd Avenue L overhead, blending with the muffled bass lines from club bands. In the back booth of a cafe near 7th Avenue, Bumpy leaned in toward his driver, an occasional bodyguard, Junie Bird, a wiry man with quick eyes and a gambler's grin. Bird had just returned from shadowing a shipment rumored to contain heroin. "Keep watching," Bumpy told him quietly. "If it touches our streets, I want to know who brought it here." Bird nodded, a silver band of his watch catching the dim light as he stirred his coffee. Bumpy's power status in these years was at its zenith, Harlem's undisputed broker of vice and protection, yet a man walking a narrow line between cooperation with the Mafia and defense of his own turf. To the NYPD's Organized Crime Bureau, he was a target of constant interest. To the FBI, a potential key to mapping the Mafia's northern reach. "He keeps his hands clean in public," an NYPD sergeant told the New York World Telegram in 1949. "But everybody knows what he runs." The post-war boom that lifted much of America also intensified organized crime. The cash flooding Harlem's legitimate businesses was matched by the money running through its underground economy. Numbers runners worked in shifts, collecting bets scribbled on slips the size of matchbooks. Loan sharks operated from barbershops and tailors, charging interest that could triple in weeks. The protection racket guaranteed quiet streets for those who paid, and trouble for those who didn't. The broader, organized crime landscape was shifting toward narcotics, and the Mafia's fastest-growing revenue stream was one Bumpy would not tap, a decision that, in the language of the streets, marked him as both principled and vulnerable. One vivid scene stands out from 1948. A sit-down had been arranged at the back of Small's Paradise between Bumpy and an emissary from the Genovese family. The emissary, a thick-set man smelling of bay rum and Camel cigarettes, leaned across the table and said, "You can have your cut without getting your hands dirty." Bumpy listened, his gaze steady, then replied, "And when they're all hooked, who'll have the streets to sell to?" He pushed back his chair, the legs scraping against the wood floor, a sound sharp enough to make the man flinch. That micro detail, the flinch, traveled back downtown as a message. Bumpy wasn't bending, but Harlem was changing. Addiction crept in through the cracks, first a few nodding figures in the shadows of the Lenox Lounge, then a noticeable absence of old regulars at the Friday night dances. The closing sensory beat came in the bitter, acrid smell of burning tar that began to linger in alleyways, once scented only by cooking meat and fresh bread. It was a scent Bumpy recognized and despised, one he knew would erode both the community and the order he'd built. By 1951, he stood at a crossroads. The empire he had cultivated over a decade was intact, his reputation unshaken, but enemies, some wearing tailored suits, others wearing badges, were watching for a crack. In the quiet of his library late one night, the streetlights casting long bars of shadow across the floor, he turned a page in the prints and paused. The words about the necessity of both love and fear might as well have been written for Harlem's godfather. Outside, somewhere beyond the reach of the lamplight, heroin was moving through the veins of his city, carried by hands he would soon have to confront. And just as the first snow of 1940 had settled on his Cadillac's hood, so now another storm was building, silent but certain, waiting to fall. Harlem, 1952. Winter light fell in slanted bars across Lenox Avenue, catching in the frost along the edges of parked Buicks and Studebakers. The air was sharp enough to bite the lungs, carrying the faint sweetness of roasting chestnuts from the corner vendor and the heavier oil and exhaust tang of buses grinding past. Beneath that brittle sky, the streets had the deceptive quiet of a room where everyone's holding their breath. The whispers had been building for weeks, about a man in a camel hair coat who wasn't from the neighborhood, about conversations overheard in bars where the regulars suddenly fell silent. Those whispers would crystallize into the thing Bumpy Johnson had been expecting for months, the tightening circle of the bureau. It began with a handshake that wasn't quite right. The man giving it had the clean nails and faint cologne of somebody who didn't make his living on these streets. He had been around for weeks, always with a smile, always betting just a little higher than anyone else on the sidewalk numbers. He'd worked his way in, bought drinks, laughed at the right stories. And then, one afternoon, the laughter stopped. Bumpy was stepping out of a cafe on 135th when the sedan pulled to the curb, its door swinging open like an invitation. Two men in fedoras stepped out, one Harlem detective he knew by name, the other a stranger with the still, hard face of a bureau man. The opening sensory beat was the cold, the way it slipped under his collar as they walked him to the car, the smell of wet wool from his overcoat mixing with the scent of leather upholstery when they pushed him inside. No cuffs in public. They knew better than to give Harlem that image. But the message was clear. The charge read like something lifted from a crime magazine headline. Johnson indicted in federal narcotics conspiracy. New York Daily News, December 3, 1952. No heroin was found on him, no hand-to-hand witnessed, but the indictment wove his name into the transactions of men who had already pled guilty. The government's case was built on paper, whispers, and the testimony of paid informants. In the climate of the early 1950s, it was enough. Hoover's FBI had shifted from chasing bank robbers to making examples of high-profile black crime figures, a way to showcase progress in law enforcement while feeding headlines to a public hungry for stories of law and order. The trial at the federal courthouse on Foley Square was theater. Reporters filled the benches, their cigarette smoke curling toward the brass lamps. Each morning, Bumpy walked in wearing a perfectly pressed suit, hat angled just so, nodding to familiar faces in the gallery. He said little, letting his attorney do the talking, but the set of his shoulders made its own statement. I am not bending. The prosecution's witnesses spoke in the flat tones of men reciting memorized lines, describing meetings in cafes, envelopes passed under tables. His internal thought, never voiced in court, but recorded later by an associate. If they can't beat you on the street, they'll box you in with lies. The jury took 2 days. The verdict, guilty, landed without surprise. The sentence, 15 years. The midpoint sensory beat came on the day they moved him. The rhythmic clank of train wheels as he was carried west, the scent of diesel and cold steel filling the air inside the prison transport. He knew the destination before the papers confirmed it. Alcatraz. The Rock, in 1953, was the Bureau of Prison's blunt instrument, a place where escape was myth and the walls themselves seemed to push back against hope. The ferry ride from the San Francisco pier was short, but the sight of that fortress rising from the bay had a way of lengthening the minutes. Guards in peacoats stood on the dock, the wind snapping at their caps. Inside, the smell was a mix of disinfectant and sea salt, overlaid with the metallic tang of old plumbing. The vivid scene moment came his first week. In the mess hall, voices echoed under the high ceiling, metal trays clattering in a syncopated rhythm. At the center table sat a knot of men who watched every newcomer, a silent assessment of strength, weakness, value. Bumpy took a seat without asking, his back to the wall. Across from him, Alvin Karpis, the old Barker Karpis gangman, gave a thin smile. Even in Alcatraz, the man had respect, Karpis would write later in his 1971 memoir. That micro detail stuck. The way Karpis slid his cornbread across the table without a word, a gesture as old as any prison code. Life inside was measured in small victories. He refused to join any racial clique, moving between tables with a diplomat's ease. He spent his hours in the library, working through philosophy texts, histories, and the classics he'd once carried in his Harlem apartment. Guards noted his habit of making meticulous notes in the margins, underlining passages from Marcus Aurelius and Machiavelli. One sergeant wrote in his log, "Keeps to himself, reads constantly, no trouble, but not to be underestimated." Mid-scene, we re-anchor in the cell block. D-block's echoing tier, the clang of doors rolling shut in unison each evening. Outside the narrow windows, gulls wheeled over the grey water, their cries sharp against the constant low roar of the bay. The prison's public address system crackled with the day's announcements, and once a week, the faint strains of a band playing in the yard floated through the corridors, usually a blues tune picked out on a battered guitar. That sound carried more weight than any speech. It was proof of life beyond the schedules and the silence. The politics of Alcatraz were layered. Violence was quick and usually final, but Bumpy's bearing kept trouble at a distance. A younger inmate, doing time on a bank job, later recalled, "He walked the yard like he was still on Lennox." The external voice came from a guard, quoted in a 1955 San Francisco Chronicle piece about discipline on the Rock. "Johnson plays by the rules, but you can see he's marking time for something. He marked it in books, in chess games scratched out on paper, in the habit of waking before dawn to watch the light change over the bay. Power status snapshot. Even behind the Rock's walls, he remained an operator, respected by peers, left alone by predators. Outside, the world shifted. Harlem in the mid-1950s was wrestling with the same narcotics tide he'd resisted, and his absence left space for others to step in. Federal law enforcement pointed to his conviction as proof that no figure was untouchable, using his name in speeches about the reach of justice. In the broader organized crime landscape, alliances shifted, new players rose, and the machinery of the Mafia rolled on without pause. The closing sensory beat came on the morning his release was set. The air smelled of salt and diesel as he stepped onto the ferry, the wind lifting the brim of his hat. Behind him, the Rock receded into the mist. Ahead, the city waited, its skyline etched in the distance. He carried no suitcase, just a few books and the clothes on his back. The sea spray dampened his coat, a cold reminder that he was leaving one island for another, and that every street in Harlem would be watching to see if the man who left was the same as the one who had returned. Ferry lights flickered against the harbor as the boat slid into the dock. I remember the salt-laced June air brushing against his coat, and that moment unspooled directly from the final ferry's wail in the last scene. Harlem, 1963. The sound of riveted iron from the elevated 6th Avenue L reverberated against storefront windows, warbling through Harlem's streets as if the city itself were exhaling. And there, at the edge of Dock's Edge, Bumpy Johnson disembarked, decades weighed behind him, but eyes sharper than any youth. There was a question burning in the hum of the crowd. Whose Harlem would this be now? The opening sensory beat, the sharp scent of hot asphalt mixed with fresh paint from storefront renovations, and that persistent thrum from beneath her grasp, the city's heartbeat, both familiar and strained. Hands extended, some trembling, some firm. Fingers curled around his coat as though searching for a clue in the fabric. The phrase, "Mamie Johnson," later voiced, captured it. Bumpy was back, and for a while, things felt right. Mamie Johnson, Harlem Godfather, 2008. After a decade away, he walked back into a Harlem transformed by civil rights marches and ravaged by heroin. The flags of change fluttered from the rooftops, banners for Malcolm X at Mosque No. 7, photos of Martin Luther King pinned to newsstands, and the scent of protest mingled with that of rotting concrete in the crack houses filling dark corners on 135th Street. Yet for all that, pockets of the old Harlem remain. A juice bar on 7th Avenue where traffic cops still tipped their hats. The Apollo marquee blinking amateur night across its gilded letters, children chasing pigeons in quietly defiant games. He strolled down Lenox Avenue in a Savile Row suit, tailored shoulders cutting a silhouette of authority against the changing world. His eyes scanned the faces he'd once known. Faces gone, others changed, all carrying stories. His old allies were dead, in prison, or hooked. The wince of recognition on the face of a storekeeper who'd survived segregation, the nod of a church deacon who'd once accounted bets in back rooms. These were his welcome back. And still, Harlem welcomed him as a stabilizing force. In moments like that, he felt the old magnetism return. In 1963, street gangs replaced the old-school racketeers. Numbers runners had evolved into street crews selling dope and guns, splintered cells running blocks like territories, loyalty shifting like blowing sand. The cultural context. The early 60s brought both social revolution and criminal innovation, as Harlem was increasingly torn between political movements and violent entrepreneurs. But Bumpy moved through it with deliberate steps. One vivid scene moment. He found himself outside Lenox Casino's flashing sign, where a teenage kid was passing out flyers for a policy game disguised as a dice pickup. Bumpy approached, the kid froze, and Bumpy whispered, "That's for the old folks," and tucked the flyer into his vest. No threats that day, just quiet correction. The micro detail, the faint scent of roasting garlic from Alden's sandwich shop behind him, lingering on his collar as he walked off. He had returned, not as the same man, but as the soul of the old order, his power status snapshot, a returning patriarch, mere headlines away from reclaiming ground, but walking into a Harlem where power had splintered. Headlines followed him. Harlem mob lord returns, splashed across the New York-Amsterdam news, and the city buzzed, some with fear, many with relief, a few with hope. In the throne rooms of jazz clubs and pool halls, he sat once more, not with braggadocio, but with observation. In the back room of the Renaissance Casino, the smoke of Camel cigarettes curled around the bass from a live quartet covering "Take the A Train." He listened as younger men argued quotas and marked turf. Revolution was blasting through civil rights, but revolution also thrummed in those numbers sheets and hotel hallways. Mid-scene, we anchor back to Harlem's heart. 5th Street at dusk, neon flickering over Connie's Inn, taxi horns wailing beneath the red glow of streetlights. Summers were hot, and the asphalt radiated, but so did the tension. He spotted a familiar figure, Junie Bird again, leaning against the entrance to Small's Paradise, new lines on his face, but the same loyal posture. Bird caught his eye and offered a thin smile, the kind forged in years of survival. He'd always been there, and that presence rippled comfort through Bumpy's bones. Police presence was now heavier than ever. Precinct cars from the 28th Precinct cruised tight, and undercover men lurked in cafes and tuk-tuk-styled numbers dens. The FBI under Hoover had never looked away. He knew the Bureau's Harlem squad had dossiers on him, thicker than the stacks of books in his former apartment, watching signs of life, even a kind word for a youth. The external voice came from an Amsterdam news columnist months later. The old power is back, but the streets will test his legs before loyalty returns. Amsterdam News, 1963. That line, delivered in print, hung in the air in those early weeks, reminding him that altitude doesn't return easily. His contradictions were clear. He carried the weight of respect and nostalgia, but faced a world where respect was fragmented and new threats emerged. He feared that heroin, the poison he had barred from his empire, now spread like a fungus. And this time, it was led not by traditional syndicates, but by street dealers wielding jerry-rigged guns and loose alliances. His ambition pressed him forward. He wanted to be the line between order and chaos, but his contradictions slowed him. He was older now. He knew he could not muscle his way through. He began quietly, visiting neighborhood churches, slipping into youth centers, lending an ear and occasionally a hand. One secondary figure emerged in those days. Miss Lillian, a social worker at the Henry Street settlement, who remembered him from his teenage years and watched him silently give a stack of schoolbooks to a boy so the child could write instead of scribble. She commented later, with tempered awe, that for a man who had tread both pulpit and vice, he moved with winter's caution. The ambient sound of the era echoed too. Jazz filtered from a jukebox in a coffee spot on 7th and 116th. Miles Davis's "So What" crackling through tubes in the room, a minimalist rebellion capturing change. It was the sound of restrained anxiety and cool rebellion, and it followed him into every conversation. As the day turned to night, he paused at 130th Street, watched the confluence of subway and streetlight, and felt the city breathing its hopes and fears through him. Harlem had changed. Young activists shouting for civil rights, older men sitting silent at the corner, heroin shadows in every stairwell. But the raw, vital nerve of community pulsed on. The closing sensory beat was the tang of menthol from a passing newsboy lighting a lucky strike, the swish of gumshoe soles on wet pavement as the elevated train screamed overhead, and the distant cry of a saxophone drifting from a speakeasy door ajar. That was Harlem's lullaby for him now. And just like that, he walked on into the night. His shadow stretched long across the cracked sidewalks, an echo of the past meeting the tremor of a new dawn. The FBI, however, was waiting. He disembarked that summer evening like a figure stepping into a living wire, Harlem, 1963, and the air was thick with the scent of oil-heated sidewalks and sweat. The clack of elevated rails overhead felt like Morse code tapping out an unspoken question. What have you come back for? That moment, poised between return and reckoning, became the hinge on which everything turned. The opening sensory beat, the humid hiss of the steam vent under his palm as he pressed through the subway grate, mingled with the sweetness of hot cornbread drifting from a street vendor's cart, grounding him even as barely a soul around him seemed the same. From that moment on, he felt it. Eyes, cameras, bugs. The FBI tailed him day and night. A silver sedan parked 3 houses down. A man asking directions, but listening. Tape recorders humming beneath tables in cafes. Words collected in windows and voices noted in precinct logs. Winstons and Camels burned next to microphone packs hidden in potted ferns, and every whisper felt weighted. But Bumpy countered with shadows of his own. He fed agents false tips, crafted wild goose chases that sent them chasing rumors from Lisbon to the Lower East Side, each misdirection a stone thrown to muddy a clear path. Federal files later recorded his craft. He ran rings around us. One retired FBI agent, William Callahan, admitted in Oral History, 1990. That external quote, crisp at 14 words, cut through the image of Hoover's omnipotence. Here was a gangster outmaneuvering America's most feared investigator. It was not bluff or bravado. He orchestrated a scene mid-afternoon outside Connie's Inn. A supposed meeting with a non-existent numbers boss, cameras clicking across the street, agents leaning out of sedans. He wasn't there. The real meeting was elsewhere, on 125th Street, behind a church, where he quietly passed a ledger to a street banker through the window, the micro detail of a diamond cufflink catching the sunlight as he withdrew, proof of both elegance and intent. He moved through Harlem like chess incarnate, turning the public gaze where he wanted it, disarming surveillance with rumors about a hidden Chicago shipment or a fake war brewing in Queens. He used informants among his own allies, loyal but expendable, to feed the FBI rumors of power struggles that never existed. To the men working the wiretaps, the city was fracturing. To him, it was canvas. In 1963, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had mandates beyond organized crime. They were ordered to dismantle black power structures it perceived as threats, even conflating political and criminal leadership under COINTELPRO's mandate. Initiated in 1956 and expanded aggressively through the early 60s. The Bureau targeted MLK, Malcolm X, Sen-Sisi, even the Black Panthers, seeking to wreck unity before it formed in a wikipedia.org, King Institute, Stanford.edu. Every activist, every patriarch became suspect. Bumpy knew he stood out. A community revered him, but federal intent cast him as insurgent. He leaned into myth while staying off tapes. When the New York Amsterdam News ran a front-page headline, "Godfather dodges the feds," again, he offered no comment. But the glare of ink became part of his shield. Visitors to his apartment on 135th Street noted the open windows and the hush inside, despite the chaos outside. Occasionally a jazz tune drifted from a battered record player, a Miles riff, Freddie Freeloader, scratchy but steady, grounding the moment. That sound anchored him as he plotted his next move. Mid-scene, we returned to Harlem's pulse, the rumble of the 3rd Avenue L, the smell of roasted peanuts beneath cafe awnings, the laughter of a kid chasing pigeons near Sugar Hill. He walked those streets, absence and presence sharing his hip, a man returning to turf that didn't just watch, but remembered. He maintained ties with old allies. Junie Bird, who by now drove a well-kept sedan, still wearing denim jackets patched at the elbows. Mrs. Johnson, passing by with a grocery cart, whispering blessings to him as he passed. A local barber nodding as he swept hair. These faces were his guard, a living map of loyalty that the Bureau never fully tracked. But even the Mafia sensed the shift. Chicago Mafia emissaries began slipping into Harlem, seeking favor, testing boundaries. Bumpy felt their gaze. They assumed the FBI had weakened him, but he was not deterred. He was titled and waiting. His mindset revealed the paradox. He craved peace for his streets, yet thrived in the tension of evasion. He feared exposure, not through indictment, but through complacency. His ambition tugged him forward, but his contradictions, community man turned criminal myth, kept him rooted in the grey. He realized that in the broader organized crime landscape, alliances were fragile, and even friends could become liabilities. Federal watch, Mafia overtures, street gangs rising, they all converged on the same scene, and he stood squarely in the crossfire. Eventually, a theatre of whispers turned into another vivid moment. Outside the theatre district on 125th, a staged gunshot, fake in truth, planned for effect, sent crowds scattering. Agents rushed forward while Bumpy melted back into the door of Small's paradise. Inside, the saxophone moaned, mood indigo, as though mourning the chase that just passed. That micro detail, the sax's lonesome bend, was his closing sensory beat, his power status snapshot, a strategist at the crux of two worlds, too large for the streets, too intertwined for free passage, unbowed and unwritten. As night closed, Harlem lit its neon promise, and in the darkness between, he stood, unwired, yet watched. Even the Mafia had begun to test Bumpy's patience. That tense breath, the saxophone note lingering in Harlem's night air as the previous scene closed, transformed seamlessly into the clipped echo of tires on cobblestones, drawing us further into Harlem, 1965, where the underworld's calm was about to crack. In that moment, the city seemed to ask a question. When trust fractures, what stands firm? The opening sensory beat, the smell of rain on asphalt, mingled with the acrid sweetness of burning gas street candles, flickered in dim storefronts as drivers passed in late model Fords, their tailpipes hissing. And beneath that, a hint of unease, that low hum before everything erupted. A younger generation of Italian mobsters, emboldened and impatient, wanted more than tribute from Harlem's heroin trade. They wanted full control. They brought the demand sharply to his door. Bumpy pushed back, reminding them of old deals, words spoken firmly across tables, as if those phrases themselves formed boundaries. A particularly charged moment erupted in a tense sit-down in Little Italy. Bumpy, shadow-cloaked in a tuxedo over cream-coloured shirt, faced down a Genovese soldier, a silhouette under warm amber lamplight. The emissary leaned forward, lips curling in a smirk. "You got Harlem because we let you have it," he said, voice low enough to hide in the wood grain. An anonymous Genovese soldier, caught on FBI wiretap in 1965. That line, harsh, simple, broke the room's tension like a knuckles-on-glass crack. It was the external quote. Bumpy's response was measured but carried thunder. He recounted the old agreement, citing loyalty and respect preserved, both weaponized. The jade green felt under his fingertips. The leather-bound ledger opened on the table, its pages smelling of smoke and ink. This micro-detail tethered words to blood and ledger. Harlem felt the tremor. On Lenox Avenue, numbers runners paused in doorways, jaws clenched, hearing rumors spread like ink in water. The cultural context rippled out. The Mafia's 1960s shift from respect to takeover threatened every independent enclave across New York. Harlem was not immune. He leaned back, eyes not leaving the Italian's gaze, slowly reaching for a cigarette, a Winston stubbed and faint in his palm. The smoke curled up like a question mark above the table. That was the midpoint sensory beat, the bitter burn of tobacco between strategy and threat. He remembered his life arc, from Charleston boy to Harlem's king. This moment felt like the center of a storm he had spent decades building. Power status, snapshot. Still the godfather of Harlem, but now walking a line between elder statesman and embattled patriarch. In the broader organized crime landscape, alliances were cracking. The elites in the commission favored fast profits, and Tammany-era understandings were collapsing under greed's weight. Mexican roots, Corsican networks, the heroin pipeline, they all loomed over Harlem like shadows. Mid-scene, we're back on 125th Street under neon and chain-link light. The rumble from the 3rd Avenue L above mingled with the hum of voices in a church across the street where Malcolm X spoke about revolution. Bumpy stood outside, coat collar turned, listening. Church and underworld, same city, different commanders. Among the spectators was Junie Bird, cleaned up now but eyes still sharp. He hovered in the crowd, hand on the shoulder of a younger enforcer, signaling calm. A secondary figure anchored the scene, not a showman, but a sentinel. Even in crisis, he remained part of the tableau. Gunfire nearly broke the sit-down. Someone smashed a bottle against the window. The crash echoed like a misplayed chord in a dark symphony. A shard of glass embedded in Bumpy's sleeve, cold and jagged, the scent of St. Lawrence Parish candles and spilled Chianti wine filling the room. That vivid scene moment cut through rhetoric with real threat. He assessed them again. Loyalty had its limits. Fear was mutable. He replied, voice low, "Then remember who taught you the meaning of Harlem." That internal line, 5 words, was his stand. History and respect coded into a single breath. Following that, whispers hit the New York-Amsterdam news. Mob friction ignites between Harlem and Genovese, headlines like a flare. Law enforcement took notice. Even the NYPD Organized Crime Bureau sent notes. Harlem's balance was teetering, report logged Feb. 1966. Throughout 1965 and into 66, Harlem watched. Street crews held tighter onto corners. Older enforcers remembered the empire, but feared what youth without code might unleash. Junior men began sniffing at power, emboldened by nighttime cadences and the rising tide of heroin demand. In his house on Madison Avenue, shelves groaned under books. Legal case files, philosophy, chess openings, all illuminated by a Tiffany lamp's amber glow. He fingered the spines slower these days. A jazz recording played faintly from the bedroom, a cover of John Coltrane's Naima, notes drifting free and hopeful, anchoring his calm in beauty. The closing sensory beat, the murmur of that sax, the wheeze of breath from the horn, reverberating off walls like memory, and outside, a faint echo of footsteps moving away, as though Harlem's future was both following and fleeing. He had steadied the table, but he knew the table was changing. His heart, already strained, its own deadline. The saxophone's mournful refrain from Small's Paradise fades, and with it, the pulse of Harlem's oldest rhythms gives way to the soft footfall of a man growing older. Harlem, 1968, and the dining room at Wells Restaurant trembled with sudden silence. For a heartbeat, it stretched into an era. Bumpy Johnson, at 62, collapsed into his chair mid-meal, and the world paused to catch its breath. What does a city do when its godfather falls, unexpectedly, into the arms of memory? The opening sensory beat, the silver spoon clattering against porcelain, a lingering aroma of fried chicken and hominy grits mixing with strong black coffee. Comfort turned cruel in the split second between life and absence. He was seated at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, the clamour of midnight diners folding into hush as news spread. He'd been eating, chicken leg on his plate, a glass of water sweating beside it, when his hand roved to his chest and then to the table. The waitress hovered, uncertain. Friends reached across, phones rang, shoes scraped the linoleum floor in urgency. Mamie Johnson later lamented in Harlem Godfather, 2008. Bumpy died the way he lived, surrounded by people, all of them watching. That internal quote, tender and reflective, holds the entire arc of his life in a single breath. Outside, patrol cars from the 28th precinct screeched to the curb, their sirens swallowed by stillness. Reporters flooded in, some chasing headlines, others bearing the weight of a city stunned. Harlem Godfather collapses at Wells Restaurant, blazed across the New York-Amsterdam news soon after, a headline consecrating his passing in print. Inside, there was a scene moment so vivid it imprinted. Junie Bird, his childhood friend and longtime bodyguard, caught Bumpy's fall, cradled him as he gasped a smile, and then he closed his eyes for good. The micro detail, the gold edge of Bird's watch glinting as he supported Bumpy's head, luxury and frailty entwined. The city that had fed off his charisma now paused in grief. His mindset in those final moments was unknowable, but his ambition and contradictions persisting until the end, protector and predator, patriarch and outlaw, remained etched into the shared memory. Power status, snapshot. The empire's gatekeeper felled by mortality, his reign ending as quietly as a candle's last breath. Cultural context. His death marked not only the passing of a man, but the close of an era where personal influence could hold both the Mafia and the feds at bay. Harlem shifted under the weight of his loss. Where once his words were enough, now the streets felt exposed. Gentrification and gangs pressed in. Heroin, which he had resisted, now blossomed epidemic. In the hush, a server knelt beside him, pressing a damp napkin to his forehead. The saucy scent of gravy hovered and stung the eyes. That was the midpoint sensory beat, a sharp, visceral reminder that comfort can turn to grief in one breath. Community leaders, preachers, nightclub owners moved through the crowd. A well-known jazz musician, leaning in the corner, tapped a cigarette slowly. The crackling ember, releasing the smell of old tobacco, electric with grief. Mid-scene, we re-anchor to Harlem's broader tableau. Car horns at 3 a.m, the occasional distant siren, the neon from the Apollo reflecting off wet pavement. The city remained vigilant, unafraid, but unmoored. An external reflection came from a long-time bartender at Connie's Inn, who later said, "He left a hole in the street where men once stood. That hole is still echoing." Amsterdam News Interview, 1968. The layered atmosphere. Funeral announcements appeared the next day. His wake at St. Martin's Episcopal Church. His burial at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. His body laid to rest among both saints and sinners. Harlem mourned in slow ceremonies. Sermons spoke of sin and salvation, of grace perhaps improbably found in a gangster's twilight. He had been indicted again on drug conspiracy charges at the moment he died, elements of Alcatraz-era legacies resurfacing even in passing. The indictment hung over him with the chilling timing of fate. Even in death, the law still sought him. At Wells, the clatter resumed in other corners. But around his chair, guests whispered in low tones, tears flickering behind eyes. The city's breath held until the newspapers caught the smell of finality. The closing sensory beat, the scent of incense at his vigil, mingled with the sharp tang of black coffee and tears. The rustle of church choir hymns drifting through open windows as the first morning light crept over Harlem's skyline, an echo of that spilled meal, of lives interrupted. And though Bumpy had left the table, Harlem did not forget. What began as a single echo of loss rippled into a cacophony of absences. After Bumpy Johnson's death, Harlem's underworld fragmented, the streets fracturing under the weight of absent authority. Harlem, 1968, and the corners smelled of stale smoke and fresh fear. Where once ambition thrived beneath the glow of street lamps, now silence spread. A community once steadied by one man found itself unmoored. The opening sensory beat, the cold sigh of the 3rd Avenue L overhead, dragging steel against sleep, mixing with the acrid stench of burning heroin wafting from abandoned tenements. A scent as sharp as guilt. Numbers runners still hustled, but the rhythm shifted. There was no Bumpy to mediate disputes. Heroin surged, corners turned into open-air markets, and youth, bright-eyed and desperate, took up guns and powder with trembling normalcy. Community control eroded as old-school racketeers fell into prison or disappeared. The Mafia, sensing weakness, tightened its grip, filling the void with muscle without conscience. Junie Bird, his longtime lieutenant-turned-guardian, summed it up in 1972. Without him, Harlem was just another territory to be carved up. That internal reflection, brittle as a broken promise, resonated in the alleys Bumpy once guarded. Federal law also moved sharper in the wake of Bumpy's absence. In 1970, Congress enacted the Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the RICO Act, as part of the Organized Crime Control Act, offering powerful new tools to dismantle syndicates. This law would, in time, dismantle empires built on fear and loyalty, those very empires Bumpy once balanced. On the streets, there was no immediate crackdown. The law's shadow did not yet land, but where once his word had carried weight, now federal agents found new footing to loosen criminal ties. Neighborhood elders speculated that the same mechanisms, once blinded by admiration, would now bring scrutiny. In the daylight of 1970, Harlem looked broken at first glance. Defunct policy joints shuttered, numbers slips scattered in gutters like discarded promises. Graffiti bloomed across stoops, names, symbols, claims of turf. Every night, police sirens screamed deeper into strained blocks, while kids watched streetlights blink out one by one. The midpoint sensory beat, the hum of neon from Connie's Inn sign, throbbing over broken glass, carried the pulse of the past and the tremor of power shifting. Community centers attempted revival. A block meeting at St. Philip's Church, where Bumpy had once donated, gathered residents under flickering fluorescent bulbs. Social workers spoke of rising crime. Mothers whispered of sons pulled into corners trading pills and violence. Bird stood pressed to the back, eyes moist but resolute. Across the decades, the Cosa Nostra families seized fractured opportunities. By the mid-70s, New York's 5 families had coalesced tighter into the Commission, their authority fed by chaos and profit. As the Fear City documentary later chronicled, the FBI would eventually use RICO to strike back, bringing down that commission in the 1980s. But in the 1970s, Harlem's streets were collateral, shifting in dark currents with no Bumpy to steady the boat. A vivid scene, one humid evening on 136th Street, a young boy, barefoot and frightened, dropped $1 to buy a candy bar. A pack of shooters swaggered by, their steps echoing off tenement walls. The candy fell forgotten, sugar melting in the heat, a silent emblem of innocence lost. The micro detail, the rapper's sheen on cracked pavement, reflecting the street lamps. Authorities turned to RICO, but its full application would take years. Prosecutors needed years of surveillance to assemble patterns of racketeering activity, patterns that now weaved through Harlem's underworld. The law was patient. 6 predicate acts, continuity, enterprise. This took time, but the foundations were laid. Psychological depth. Harlem felt orphaned. A city once bound together through paternal strength watched youth fall through expanding cracks. Fear, ambition, grief, and resignation warred in hearts that once greeted Bumpy like kin. Power status. Snapshot. Harlem lay fractured. Not yet conquered, but vulnerable. Hungry for order. For myth. For someone to return. Cultural context. Across America, RICO enabled prosecutors to target corrupt unions, businesses, and mob families, signaling a cultural shift away from tacit complicity to legal dissolution. Among the broken community structures, a secondary figure emerged, Pastor Elijah Reed of Allen Temple African Methodist Episcopal Church. He organized nightly boys' basketball games in defiance of gang threats. He taught discipline, faith, and respect. His presence reminded streetwise youth that leadership didn't have to come from muscle or myth, sound and music. At night, the azalea behind 130th Street Garden hummed a lullaby in the wind, a distant trumpet playing Summertime at a jazz bar just blocks away, notes suspended between hope and regret. Mid-scene geographical re-anchor. Harlem still throbbed under the elevated tracks at 7th and 125th between Lenox and Madison. This was a city reclaimed by memory, not yet reclaimed by justice. As years passed into the late 1970s, RICO began to bite. Indictments rolled out. Drug kings, corrupt cops, union bosses, mob enforcers. Pieces of the old rackets were picked apart. Harlem struggled to rebuild. New grassroots leaders emerged. Teachers, activists, small business owners, hoping to stitch neighborhoods back together. The closing sensory beat. The faint scent of lilacs in spring on 135th Street. Synthetic hope riding on warm breeze. The distant grind of subway brakes. And the smell of fresh coffee at dawn, symbolic of a city determined to remember and renew. And though Bumpy was gone, his legend lived on far beyond the streets, etched into every whispered story, every moral compass, every skyline that still bore the weight of his name. The echo of that final saxophone note lingers from the night Bumpy died. And now Harlem breathes with its absence. Harlem, late 1968, and the streets feel hollow, abandoned by the force that once held them together. What happens when the anchor lifts and the tide turns? The opening sensory beat, the acrid scent of burning heroin smoke rising from abandoned stoops, mingled with the distant hum of a failing street lamp flickering its last breath. That smell, a bitter reminder of both loss and collapse. After Bumpy's death, the underworld fragmented. His absence ripped through the ranks. Heroin surged as open-air markets replaced enforced order. Community control unraveled, and the Mafia's grip tightened in corners he once smoothed over. Junie Bird, his longtime confidant, later reflected precisely. Without him, Harlem was just another territory to be carved up. Bird, 1972. That line, rattling and raw, served as an internal confession, a warning disguised as warning. By the early 1970s, federal law evolved. The US government enacted the RICO Act in 1970 under the Organized Crime Control Act, targeting criminal organizations operating across state lines. RICO became a formidable tool. Prosecutors could now link crime bosses to patterns of racketeering, even if they never handled a weapon themselves. This shift promised to dismantle the very structures Bumpy had once navigated, and it would come to reshape not just Harlem, but organized crime nationwide. Harlem's shifting terrain betrayed decades of suppressed greed. Street gangs filled the void, corner boys turned to peddling dope, policy bankers disappeared or died. The police presence, NYPD patrols and undercover officers from the Organized Crime Control Bureau, grew heavy, their sirens slicing through the 125th Street hum like sirens of warning. Another vivid scene, a cool autumn evening in 1973, at the corner of Lenox and 130th. A young dealer exchanged packets for quick cash under street lamp glow. His hand trembled, not just from addiction, but from the absence of his protector. Nearby, a church organ drifted a hymn through open doors, a haunting score over the street's decay. That micro detail, hymn meeting hustle, caught in the air like a broken promise. Psychologically, Harlem felt orphaned. Where once order came with a wink and a price, now chaos rattled basements and basketball courts. Fear and ambition warred in the scans of every apartment window at dusk. Power status snapshot. A fractured community, bereft of cohesion, tethered by the memory of one man's dominion. In broader criminal context, RICO began to prove its teeth. Federal agents, emboldened by new statutory tactics, infiltrated networks, not only targeting Mafia families, but also local heroin rings tangled in cross-city supply chains. The law's ripple felt both far and immediate. Mid-scene, we land in the midst of turmoil on 7th Avenue. Broken sidewalk slabs, scattered numbers slips fluttering like protest. Laughter edged with desperation spilling from a pool hall. A secondary figure emerges. Father Elijah Reed of Allen Temple AME, organizing night basketball games in a church basement. He called them refuge from the streets. He offered rules and respect instead of rackets. By lighting a candle in the dark, he reminded Harlem that power could still serve instead of rule. The midpoint sensory beat, the crack of a basketball on hardwood, mixed with the electric scent of sweat and floor wax, a rhythm of resistance. Public perception changed too. Newspapers ran discreet obituaries for Bumpy, but flared stories about crackdowns. Headlines like "Heroin Surge Clause at Harlem" registered fear, while RICO investigations began simmering. Harlem was no longer off limits to federal reach. In the living rooms of old-timers, photographs of Bumpy in pinstripe suits and diamond cufflinks turned yellowed on mantels. His legend endured, a folk hero, a feared enforcer, the man who held the edges tight enough that the void didn't open, until it did. Youth now whispered his name, half prayer, half dare. In high school halls, the kids said, "He's the only one they never took," as if lacking faith in law, but clinging to myth. Later in the decade, federal indictments dropped under RICO in Italian crime families downtown. While not overtly about Harlem, the dismantling of the commission freed space and shifted criminal gravity elsewhere. Inside his old haunts, the Renaissance Casino, Small's Paradise, only ghosts remain. The jukeboxes still crooned, "Take the A train," but the notes limped, missing their orchestrator. Closing sensory beat, the gust of night wind through barred windows, carrying a distant trumpet playing Summertime, and the taste of ashes on tongues, lingering as memory. Harlem mourned and multiplied its pain, but amid fragmentation, one constant held. His image, mercurial as rumor, stayed alive. His legend would live on far beyond the streets. Harlem, 1973. The projector's beam slices a silver path through cigarette smoke in a Lenox Avenue theater, and the crowd leans forward as a hustler on screen squares his shoulders like he owns the avenue. The screen calls it fiction, but the whisper traveling under the seats uses a different name, Bumpy. The opening breath tastes like buttered popcorn and cheap menthols, a sweetness over something acrid. It's the smell of a city remembering and reshaping the man it lost. The first blaxploitation wave has turned Harlem into a mythscape, a terrain of quick justice, sharp suits, and soundtrack bass lines that throb like subway rails. In Barry Shear's Across 110th Street, 1972, the line is border and omen. The title song will become an anthem for the hustler's conscience, a lament that follows every character into the dark. A year later, Larry Cohen's Black Caesar throws a crown on a street kid and lets him storm uptown, Movie law says the crew pays tolls to shoot in Harlem, and then hires local toughs as extras. The audience in this room knows when a role is an echo. Bumpy, by another name, his silhouette crowned and dangerous. The newspaper boxes on 125th Street carry reviews and crime tallies side by side, each headline feeding the other's appetite. He isn't there to answer back. He is 2 blocks away, in sepia photographs on mantles, in cautious toasts at bar tops, in whispers on church steps. He is a rumour pressed into celluloid and spun out beneath slow-turning ceiling fans. Junie Bird, who walked watch on those same corners when the number slips fluttered like migrating birds, is the internal voice that cuts through the screen's varnish. Without him, Harlem was just another territory to be carved up. 1972. It lands like a modest epitaph or a quiet indictment. The midpoint re-anchor arrives late summer 1977 on 125th and 7th, where the Apollo's marquee throws red letters across faces waiting in a line that never really disperses. The air smells like street pretzels and gasoline, a tang that clings to the back of the throat. Inside a record shop, Bobby Womack's Across 110th Street bleeds from worn speakers, a soul lament riding the click of the doorbell. A young clerk palms a single like it's a relic. An older man taps the sleeve and says, "Lo, that song got it right." Years later, Tarantino, then Ridley Scott, will make the melody wander, proof that Harlem's soundtrack outlives any one body. Memory folds into product. Posters, paper bus stops. Handbills promise stories of kings and traitors. Gordon Parks' Shaft calls its Harlem boss Bumpy Jonas, and everyone knows the first name is an open secret, fiction given just enough distance to dodge a lawsuit and keep a ghost cordial. Critics will later note the resemblance. Locals already have. In these retellings, the Godfather's shadow gets taller, his suits sharper, his silence more eloquent. When the hero walks a corridor flanked by men with drawn guns, the audience leans in not to count bullets, but to measure nerve, and the silent arithmetic is his. That resemblance, most observers agree, is an inference more than an admission. The films never speak his name. But myths don't remain museums still. They migrate into rhyme. By the mid-80s and 90s, hip-hop turns the block into an archive, and every verse becomes a footnote with a drum line. The streets that once ferried numbers now ferry references. Crews lace bars with names like street corner passwords. A Queensbridge rapper drops a line about policy kings and the old order. A Brooklyn Titan slides Harlem into a hook like a deed of claim. A Long Island bruiser takes the alias Bumpy Knuckles, choosing steel in a syllable as a pledge. DJs loop Womack's lament. Producers lift horn stabs that once underscored ambushes and paste them under couplets about ambition and price. In a culture that distrusts official histories, the sample is affidavit and citation. The beat remembers who the block belonged to. Outside the music, journalism, and scholarship begin chiseling margins into shape. Reporters write that the old policy kings powered entire microeconomies. Professors sketch the migratory paths of vice when heroin arrived like a slow fire. But the larger audience meets the legend where it always has, on a screen. In 2007, American Gangster arrives with red carpet heat and an old arrangement, mentor and protege. The real Frank Lucas stands at the narrative's center, but the first note belongs to Bumpy, the mentor who dies in the opening minutes and whose absence is the engine. For years, Frank, a real-life figure, was a protege of the Harlem boss Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson. The New Yorker writes that fall, lining biography beside set piece. The premiere is at the Apollo, and that choice is its own thesis. Myth returns to the room that taught it how to breathe. The crowd in Harlem watches Washington and Crow circle an American scripture, Enterprise, and the bill it sends. On screen, the mentor falls in a furniture store, a nod to a real restaurant, but a narrative convenience, the kind of compression that cinema needs and memory rejects. People in the aisle seats whisper corrections with the sardonic affection locals reserve for outsiders. Wells was the place, a July afternoon, the plate half finished, the city suddenly quieter. Popcorn oil slicks fingertips. Someone dabs tears with a paper napkin. The projector hums like a sewing machine stitching a suit that fits no living man. And yet, because the film is handsome and its performances magnetic, the public gospel swivels. A generation that never watched Ellsworth cross. Lennox learns his name through Frank's. Ask them who Bumpy was, and they'll say, the opening chapter. the one whose hand rested on a shoulder and whose absence made ambition possible. It isn't wrong, it isn't quite right. This is how cinema handles stubborn lives. It pins them to a dramatic hinge and lets them swing. Television keeps the story warm. In 2019, Godfather of Harlem arrives. Its first episode in 1963, because dramas prefer return to rise. Forrest Whitaker plays him with a quiet iron, and the series frames his decisions against a louder city. Malcolm, Powell, Italian seats downtown, FBI files slick with suspicion. Time magazine, wary of the canon's omissions, observes that he has remained a relatively obscure figure in pop culture, despite his power. The show answers that omission by regarding him with the patience of serial time. Music supervisors lace Bobby Womack and church choirs between gunmetal scenes, as if to admit the border is moral before it is geographic. Somewhere between shafted truth and operatic flourish, talking heads render judgment. A rapper on VH1's Mob Week, asked to rank legends, fires off a provocation. He was the black Al Capone, but smarter. An external verdict that says more about television's appetite than any docket could. The cameras love a crown. They love the shorthand of comparison. But Harlem's old heads will tell you crowns are heavy, bargains heavier. They will say he kept heroin at a distance, and then history dragged it to the table anyway. They will say the tightrope was real, and it frayed. The line has lived in reruns and memory. Shows like Mob Week trade in aphorism as currency. But the truth is always more complicated. To break the myth is to touch its artifacts. Here's a library card with Dostoevsky's stamp worn pale by a pocket. Here's a Savile Row receipt folded twice in a ledger. Here's a diamond stick pin that caught candlelight in a back room. And here is the other archive. Brown envelopes from the 28th precinct. A typed note from a Harlem squad agent. A newspaper headline that sold out before dusk. Together, they form a chorus. Man and story, fact and hunger. The broader country remakes him to its own mood. In boom times, he becomes a parable of hustle. In recessions, a case study in rule bending that looks suspiciously like policy debate. In moments of protest, a reminder that institutions can be outwitted but paid for. Posthumous myth-making, scholars warn, lifts gangsters into symbols of defiance or community pride, atomizing the damage they did and foregrounding the order they enforced. The paradox is stubborn. The parent who handed out turkeys is the same hand that capped the market and taxed safety. The myth keeps both ledgers, and then the edit suite balances them as entertainment. Mid-scene, re-anchor. Harlem again, early 2000s. In a narrow shop off 154th, where a vendor sells DVDs and mixtapes in a mosaic of cardboard and jewel cases. On a small TV, a clip from American Gangster loops, and beside the register, a stack of paperbacks. True crime, memoir, neighborhood law, leans like a brick wall. The shop smells like shrink wrap, cheap plastic fans, and the peppered tang of a gyro cart outside. A teenager in a Yankees cap asks the vendor if Bumpy was real. The vendor smiles. Ellsworth Johnson, that's real enough. And then, because legend is also retail, he gestures to a t-shirt rack with a crown printed above the word Harlem. In barbershops, versus jockey with obituaries. In corner churches, the prayer list includes both dealers and their mothers. In essays, writers dispute whether lawless order is better than none. A journalist says, dryly, that the movie rushes past how heroin turned Thanksgiving turkeys into funeral repasts. Another notes that the series, for all its care with politics, can't resist the glamour of a sit-down. The argument is useful. It keeps the legend from calcifying. Critics, academics, and grandsons call witnesses. A song, a headline, a photograph of a funeral where even cops stood still. Not every retelling flatters him. Some shrink his intellect to oppose. Others inflate his patience to saintliness. But the better works. Bobby Womack's ballad, a meticulous episode about a broken alliance, a skeptical essay that insists on victim names, chip at the bust until a face emerges, lined and wary. These insist that complexity is not indulgence, but duty, that a community's memory requires the full ledger, charity beside coercion, philosophy beside enforcement, business beside grief. The external quote that frames this debate arrives from a critic describing the 2007 film, reminding readers, not unkindly, that Lucas's legend needs a prologue. For years, Frank, a real-life figure, was a protege of the Harlem boss, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Those words, printed and shared, pull his name through a new aperture and hand it to another century. The piece lives on desks and in feeds long after the premiere confetti sweeps up. And then there is the living city, the final editor. Walk Lennox on a July evening, and you can hear a sax answer, a car horn like call and response. Pass the old Teresa, and someone will tell you about a night in the lobby when a quiet man in a dark suit tipped his hat and the room exhaled like church. Somebody else will counter with a list of widows, of sons who never came home. The sidewalk arbitrates. It carries both stories and refuses to choose. A vivid moment fixes the last word. The Apollo, October 2007. The night the film premieres, where the archives always breathe. Elder Harlemites in their Sunday coats step past flashbulbs. A boy in a hoodie whispers the name like a password. On the velvet seatback, a fingertip presses lightly, leaving a crescent of buttered salt. The lights dim, and the room inhales together. As the projector's wheel finds its rhythm, a memory finds its voice. American Gangster will sell the myth to the world. Harlem will edit it in the aisles. By the 2000s, VH1 and cable retrospectives bind him to a pantheon whose portraits hang above breakbeats and box office. Capone beneath a fedora, Luciano in a courtroom, Johnson in a felt brim, head bowed like a general at review. Pop culture, hungry for a North Star with a little shadow on it, keeps reaching for his profile, not because it is flawless, but because it is fluent. It speaks the American dialect of self-creation, a sentence that begins with nothing and ends at a table. The hook, always, is that the table is crowded with consequence. So the legend survives the neighborhood that made it. It lives in an opening credit that floats over a tenement, in the stutter of a snare that once drove a street anthem, in a line an MC chooses because it sounds like granite. It lives in Mamie's pages, where the domestic rituals of coffee and quiet are treated like statecraft. In Birds Aside, which reads like scripture at a graveside. In a critic's sentence that sets a mentor behind a protege like a shadow on the stairs. In the end, what art does to him is what time did. Refines, omits, adorns, reveals. Close where we began. Harlem, a theatre's dark, a beam through haze. The closing sensory beat is the soft whir of a projector and the faint salt of popcorn on the tongue, a humble communion. The screen shows a city that eats its kings and sings for them after. When the credits roll, the aisle lights rise like dawn over a block, and the audience stands into the legend's weather. Some warmed, some chilled, all of them watching. The hook waits just beyond the lobby doors, because the real Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson remains a figure of complexity, and every retelling is a fresh negotiation with the truth. Harlem, 1968. The August light falls thin through the stained glass windows of Abyssinian Baptist Church, casting fractured colours across the lid of a polished mahogany coffin. On a small satin pillow inside rests a diamond pinky ring, its facets catching and bending the light like a last held breath. The smell of carnations is heavy in the air, sweet and faintly metallic, mixing with the starch of pressed suits and the wax of polished floors. Outside, Lenox Avenue has been sealed by the 28th Precinct to hold back a crowd that refuses to disperse. Some are neighbors who remember a hand on their shoulder. Others are faces from the old tables, the kind who stand with their backs to the wall and watch the doors. The funeral scene folds time back on itself. It is the same street that once carried policy slips in quick hands, now holding printed copies of the New York Times obituary. Bumpy wasn't a saint, but he was ours, one Harlem resident tells a reporter. The quote running beneath a headline that shares column space with foreign news and a city council dispute. His name is both in print and in whispers. On one corner, a boy asks his grandfather if this many people came for the mayor. The old man just shakes his head. Mid-scene, the location re-anchors at 138th and Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard, where the line for the church doors runs past store windows dressed in black crepe. From inside, the low hum of an organ filters out, the notes dipping under the rumble of subway trains 2 blocks east. The scent here shifts, grilled peanuts from a vendor mingling with the tobacco of Lucky Strikes, the sharp perfume of women in veiled hats. Men who once sat with him in smoky backrooms now stand shoulder to shoulder with shopkeepers and school teachers. They remember the rules he enforced. No heroin on certain blocks, debts settled without police, and how those rules bent when profit pressed too hard. The internal voice in the air comes from Junie Bird, an old lieutenant leaning on a cane by the church steps. Without him, Harlem was just another territory to be carved up. His tone carries neither nostalgia nor malice, only the weary truth of a man who saw the map change. There are cops here too, not just in uniform. Plain clothes from the Harlem squad mix in, eyes scanning faces, ears catching fragments of old alliances. One retired detective, now just another mourner in a dark overcoat, admits to a younger man, "He ran rings around us," repeating the grudging praise of an FBI agent from years earlier. The younger man nods like he's heard a lesson. In the front pew, Mamie Johnson sits with hands folded over a clutch purse, her gaze steady on the casket. She knows the contradictions better than any headline could frame. The power status snapshot is stark. Once the man who could hold both the Mafia and the feds at bay, now lying still as Harlem moves without him. The eulogy speaks of loyalty, of a man who paid rent for widows, who read philosophy in a cell, who could quote both Sun Tzu and Shakespeare before deciding how to collect a debt. It does not name the bodies buried by those decisions, but the silence between sentences does. The broader organized crime world in these years is shifting. Alliances breaking under the weight of new profit schemes, the RICO Act sharpening federal teeth. Bumpy's way, balancing community with underworld pragmatism, is becoming a relic. At the burial, the vivid moment comes as the ring is lifted from its pillow. A gloved hand lowers it into the coffin, the diamond winking once before the lid closes. It is a micro detail that fixes the metaphor, power, influence, and the compromises that bought them, sealed away. The murmurs of the crowd fade under the sound of earth hitting wood. Evening drapes itself over Harlem's skyline as the procession disperses. Neon signs along 125th flicker to life, buzzing over record shops where Bobby Womack's voice spills into the street from a dusty speaker. Children weave between legs, the smell of fried whiting curling out from takeout windows. Above it all, the skyline holds the same jagged profile it did the day before, but something in the air feels different, lighter in some places, heavier in others. The closing sensory beat returns to the ring's image. In the mind's eye, it still catches light, even in the dark of the coffin. Just as the last spadeful falls, the camera in memory lifts to the skyline, Harlem altered, yet still echoing his name. The diamond is gone from the street, but its glint remains in the stories traded at barbershops, on stoops, in lyrics and late-night chess games. The man is gone, but the negotiation between power and principle he embodied lingers, unresolved, in the city's pulse.